Yes, it's my privilege to say just a couple of words of welcome, not really an introduction. Heather's going to do the formal introduction, but just a word of welcome. I am, of course, delighted to welcome colleagues to this event, to welcome colleagues to Hope University, particularly our distinguished guest, who's come over from Manchester, and as Dean, of course, to make a particular welcome to another faculty event, which we're delighted to see take place as part of our regular sessions, a regular series of talks on aspects related to education, policy, practice, history, psychology, and a number of other things. So a very warm welcome. Research is very much part of the faculty's portfolio and very much part of our culture. And that's true within the faculty, of course, and it's true across the university. And I'm sure everybody in this room, with possibly one or two exceptions, has already heard on numerous occasions how we've submitted 52% of our staff from the ref at 2-star and above. At least that's what our external assessors have told us. An indication of the way in which the university has made significant strides in its research activity and portfolio over the last few years. We've also said consistently over the past several years that we are a university, but we're a university with a college feel to it. And we want to maintain the best of that college experience, to maintain the best of the tradition from which we have come. And the personal touch is very important to us. And so while research is very much a part of everything that we do, it's very much part of the day-to-day business here at Liverpool Hope. We do like to come aside and to stop and to celebrate that research activity rather than just shoving it into the ref 2020 drawer or filing cabinet and moving on to the next project. So it's important that we have this opportunity to interact and to celebrate achievement. So that's what we're doing today. And thank you very much indeed then for coming to join with me in celebrating another achievement from Heather Ellis, who has, with a colleague, worked on this project, which I'm sure she'll say more about in just a moment. For once, I feel just a little bit closer to home than I normally do on these occasions, in that it's something that's published by Brill in Biblical Studies. You know, it's a really, really good book, absolutely heavyweight, top-class academic publisher in the context of biblical studies particularly. And I'm sure that's the case with history and education as well. So at least I'm able to identify with that on this occasion. So I'll hand over now to Heather Ellis to say a little bit more about the
Thanks, Kenneth. I always find myself a bit short at this. I'm actually standing on my tiptoes. Yes, I'm not going to talk to you for very long, just a couple of minutes, say a little bit more about the book. It started life almost 4 years ago at a conference in Berlin when I was a lecturer at the Humboldt. It started when I first met Ulrike Kirchberger, who's my co-editor, at a conference in Oxford in 2010, which was about imperial scholarly networks. So it was about the British Empire and scholarly connections between the so-called white settler colonies and the British Isles. And Ulrike and I kept asking, well, what about the German scholars? What about the French? What about the Americans? What about the Spanish? Because at all these events that were being talked about, there were lots of Europeans, there were lots of people from other nations, and yet they didn't fit into this imperial framework which was being discussed. So out of that conference, we had a discussion about we'd really like to look at Anglo-German connections and networks in the same time period, the Long 19th Century, which is very long in the context of this book. It starts in about 1770 and ends in 1945. So it's really stretching the definition of long. Extremely long would have been better, but Brill would have let us put that on the front cover. I have to thank the Großbritannien Central, the Centre for British Studies at Humboldt University, who actually funded the initial conference, which had over 40 speakers and was quite, we actually didn't get funding for it. It was the only one of 3 conferences I was involved in which didn't get funding that year, and it was the one I was most disappointed about. and they stepped in at the last minute and provided the full funding, which was really kind of them, and hosted it as well, and provided all the administrative support. And that was one of the reasons that I really wanted to turn this into a book. I have to thank Ulrike, who was absolutely exemplary as a co-editor. When I was away on maternity leave, having had Finn, my second child, she really did everything in that period, and she's really sorry that she can't be here today, as are the contributors, who are mostly in Germany or in other countries, and it was a little bit too much to get them to come here, and it's also example of time in other countries, so it's a shame not to have any of them here, but they all sent best wishes, all of them actually, beforehand, so that was quite nice. I think the only other thing is to thank Chris for coming not too far from Manchester to talk to us about Anglo-German relations in higher education in the 19th century. Is that right? I'm doing it from memory.
Pretty much it's a response to the book.
It is a response to the book, yeah. He's read the book. And said he likes it, so I'll take that as a good sign. Chris Manius is a lecturer in modern European history. Is that correct? University of Manchester. He is an expert on Anglo-German affairs and Anglo-German relations, so I'm really pleased that he can come and talk to us. And I'll hand over to Chris. Thank you very much.
Hi, and thanks Helen for the invitation. I was actually due to speak at the conference which Helen based the book around, but I had to cancel at the last minute because I was just starting a new job. So thank you for forgiving me on this, and thanks for the invitation. And I very much enjoyed the volume. It's a very sort of timely and a very sort of important, I think, contribution to a whole range of different fields. The chapter's going to cut across a wide variety of different areas. So there are chapters on Antarctic exploration, there are chapters on physiology, chapters on classical scholarship, there's a chapter on scholarly studies of Judaism, and on popular science publishing. So across a whole variety of different areas in modern history, but given a very strong and a very good coherence by all dealing with these central questions of how scholars in Britain and Germany interact with one another in these fields across the 19th century, and also how they find themselves operating, cooperating, and sometimes competing within a much wider series of international, global, and imperial networks. So its significance really goes beyond this sort of bilateral Anglo-German set of connections. The other thing which I very, very much liked about it is that it looked across scholarly relations across a wide variety of different fields, so classics, theology, medicine, anthropology, and so on. And so in doing this, it was able to draw links between different areas of history, so between the history of science, between intellectual history, and the history of education. So areas which are really quite closely related thematically, but which aren't often drawn together in the literature as much as they possibly should be. But alongside this, through dealing with these concepts of Anglo-German relations and cultural exchange, it can also sort of build into much wider issues around diplomatic relations, the transfer of ideas, and imperial and nation-building projects in the modern era. So very sort of good, very kind of comprehensive sort of volume. Now, the main thing I'm going to be talking about is basically a response to this volume across three main areas. But as a kind of brief way of introduction on my own perspective about this, I've come across these types of Anglo-German relations in my academic career through four major projects. The first was in my doctoral research in my first monograph, which looked at how scholars in 19th century Britain, France, and Germany developed a concept of a prehistoric past and their own racial origins in the 19th century. So how they really attempted to construct their deepest sort of biological ancestry in this highly ideologically charged nation-building sort of way. But within this project, I was very much seeing that even within these kind of intrinsically national disciplines, you had scholars in France, in Germany, and Britain all cooperating, all collaborating, all sending each other publications, often skulls, things like this, prehistoric artifacts, and attempting to construct their national histories in a way which was very often quite collaborative and quite international. In my second research project, I worked at the German Historical Institute in London, which is an institute which is still attempting to build Anglo-German connections in history, so I'm almost a product of these processes myself if we stretch them into the modern period. And here I was working on a project called British Envoys to Germany, which was a source publication series publishing interesting diplomatic reports from the British ambassadors to the German states in the 19th century. And what was very striking here was that British ambassadors within Germany, they weren't just interested in reporting on what you might expect them to be reporting, so military affairs, international conferences, treaty negotiations and so forth, but they were also very, very interested in technological, intellectual and scientific affairs. So you had the British ambassador in Bavaria reporting on Professor Liebig's development of his essence of meat, which goes on to produce oxo in the later 19th century, and this has been the subject of a very interesting article by Jan Ruger, which came out recently. You had British ambassadors in Saxony reporting on steam shipping technology along the Danube, and really taking a very, very strong interest in all these scientific developments going on within the German lands. In my current project, I'm looking at the history of paleontology in an international context from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. So again, like this volume, my long 19th century is stretching again up until about 1940. And in this, I'm also very, very interested in how scientific exchange and international exchange not only goes on between British and German scholars, who are always very, very important sort of nodes and connecting points within international scientific networks, but also how they interact with American scholars, with scholars in Australia, Africa, and in colonial contexts in this other collaborative attempt to develop ideas on the history and development of life from its sort of origins up until the modern form that we see around us. Now, as I said, I'm going to, for the rest of the talk, I'm really going to focus around what's in the book, but I think this is kind of quite important to bring out, because even in this sort of quite early stage research career, which I have, you still see all of these Anglo-German entanglements, all of these Anglo-German intellectual relationships operating on a wide variety of levels, so on the scholarly, on the colonial, on the diplomatic, and so on. So this really kind of builds into these notions that these collaborations and these exchanges work on a wide variety of different levels and have a wide range of impacts on interactions between the two countries and wider intellectual developments coming off them. Now, what I'm primarily going to be talking about in the rest of this paper is how the book really relates to big issues in modern history across three big areas. And what really struck me the most was the way in which the contributions in the book engage with, and in most cases sort of develop and revise, two big dominant narratives in the interpretation of Anglo-German relations in the 19th century, and also the development of scholarship and intellectual institutions across the whole of this long 19th century period. The first and perhaps the most obvious is of the notion, the general notion of the 19th century, and particularly its later phases, being characterized by what's been termed by Paul Kennedy in a very influential book published in 1980, The Rise of Anglo-German Antagonism. And this is quite a straightforward narrative that Britain and the German states get on very, very well until the 1870s, when the formation of a new and politically ambitious German empire and the tensions around things like colonial policy, nation building, and the rise of large-scale popular nationalism really drive a wedge between these formerly good relations and move steadily on towards the First World War and a sort of inexorably rising conflict. Now, the contributions in this book do a lot to revise this idea, as many of them seem to indicate not only that you have a continuity of Anglo-German cooperation on these scholarly levels across this kind of classic breakpoint of Anglo-German antagonism, but some of the chapters also show how Anglo-German collaboration actually draws precisely off these wider currents of technological modernization, empire building, and national competition, which have often been seen as simply feeding into national competition in a very sort of linear kind of way. The second big important narrative, which in some respects, if you think about it initially, is at odds with this Anglo-German antagonism thesis, is that of the rise of the research university as the key zone of scholarly and intellectual production across the 19th century. And here you have, again, the classic narrative that the German states, from really the late 18th century onwards, developed a very, very efficient and effective form of intellectual institution in the 19th century, of the local universities spread across the German lands with their staff of very highly trained professional scholars, and these are the key forces driving forward new disciplines and new institutions across this century. And this is then broadly recognized internationally, and other countries, so Britain, but also France, Germany, Russia, and so on, adopt this German model to develop their own professional university-based systems from the close of the 19th century. However, again from this volume, we do see that this process is, it certainly occurs to a degree, but it's very often strongly resisted by scholarly institutions in Britain. Again, also German scholars quite frequently looked at other forms of British scientific institutions to emulate and develop their own new institutions and networks. And also that other forms of institutions, not just universities, but also things like museums, learned associations, and so on, are also crucial for developing new forms of knowledge and new disciplines across this period. And it's not just research universities which are driving this. Now, of course, there is potentially this danger that if we demolish all of these big narratives, we're simply left without much of a direction. But luckily, this book doesn't really do this, as the organizing principle in it takes us into another sort of direction. Instead, what we're seeing in this book is part of a wider trend, which is putting this classic focus on Anglo-German intellectual relations into a newer sort of narrative, which is really becoming something of a new orthodoxy, or at least a new organizing principle across modern history, of looking at the modern era as a period of increased global interconnectedness, as a period of movement, of a period of transmission, as ideas, as knowledge, as institutions spread all throughout the world. And this, there's quite, and now obviously this is occurring alongside things like nation and empire building, so there are obviously clear power imbalances within this, but it's all participating within these broad processes of linking the world together and transmitting things across a whole range of boundaries which scholars have often sort of themselves been limited by. Now, there's often a criticism which has been directed against this kind of history, or this kind of approach, that it potentially presents a bit too much of a rosy or unproblematic picture of a period which certainly sees some interconnectedness, but also definitely sees the formation of very territorially cohesive empires, very strong nation states. But luckily this sort of criticism doesn't pertain to this book, because where the Anglo-German case study within these wider relations really pays off is that the very definite kind of tensions and obstacles within the Anglo-German relationship, you really can't sort of ignore them. And so while we're dealing with a history of cooperation and collaboration on some levels, we're also dealing with issues of tension, of blockage, of misunderstanding, and particularly as we move into the years around in the First World War, a very sort of large rupture between Anglo-German relationships. And so we can't really tell this as an easy narrative of inevitable closeness, but we have to pay attention to this process as something which is quite variable, often quite messy, and quite contingent. So to start with, I'm going to be going into this issue of Anglo-German antagonism in a bit more detail, and this is one which has really dominated comparative studies of Britain and Germany, as well as studies of Anglo-German relations for quite some time. And this really presents something of a sort of two-stage model, which is largely tied to political and economic conditions within the German states themselves. So we have this classic idea that at the beginning of the 19th century, Britain and Germany are very sort of close allies. albeit with the German states being much economically and militarily weaker, being in something of a subordinate position. But broadly, you see a good deal of good relations and exchange between the two countries, particularly with German liberals, who very often look to Britain as a sort of ideal political system that they want to kind of build themselves in Germany, or with British statesmen and diplomats looking at the German states as their most potentially reliable trading partners and political partners on the continent. But then we have, with the wars of the 1860s and particularly the unification of 1871, things are often presented as going wrong, first in the Bismarck period, but then especially accelerating in the reign of Kaiser Wilhelm II, as the two nations become increasingly antagonistic and opposed to one another, particularly in colonial and naval affairs. Now, this book does aim to decenter this narrative in many ways, with a number of the contributions aiming to show broad continuities across these two periods, also often showing how scholarly relations often have their own set of dynamics and move at their own kind of rhythm. And also driving home the point that even as we move into the 1900s, relations between German and British scholars remain quite close and cooperative. And so the Anglo-German antagonism model in its sort of classic statement doesn't really hold up. So in this is actually part of a sort of wider trend in Anglo-German history, as there's been a great deal of work recently looking at how Anglo-German exchange really continues across the whole of the 19th century and even accelerates as we move into the latter decades and decades just before the First World War. And there have been a whole load of studies on this, looking at student exchange programs, looking at technological transfer, looking at the spread of conservation ideas, architectural models, as well as things like economics, goods and commodities and so on. However, this literature has also looked at things like higher diplomatic and colonial levels. For example, looking at how very often Anglo-German colonial policy in places like South Africa or China was often based around cooperating across colonial boundaries, with British and German colonial authorities often cooperating in things like labour migrations, in things like suppressing indigenous revolts, and with institutions like, say, the Chinese Maritime Customs, even though it's very much a British-run thing, or has a very, very large German staff. So even within this area of what you could say classic Anglo-German antagonism, you do see again as much collaboration and cooperation as competition. This is also something which comes out in some of the chapters in the book, where we see Anglo-German scientists operating in colonial contexts, collaborating a great deal. So Hilary Howe's chapter is very, very good, looking at collaboration between British and German anthropologists in New Guinea and how they both coordinate their efforts and exchange information and theories studying the indigenous population. Or there's also Pascal Schilling's chapter on Anglo-German Antarctic exploration, which draws out the point that even in this, what's often been taken as one of these classic issues where the two nations compete of which one could reach the pole first, and then both, I think, beat by the Norwegians, aren't they? But even in this kind of classic instance of international competition, you still have them exchanging ideas, exchanging theories, working out where to buy huskies, all this kind of stuff, and working together in this sort of cooperative idiom and with a common sort of project. Now, one of the potential issues in this new literature on the Anglo-German relationship has been drawn out by Jan Ruger recently, in that drawing attention to all of these instances of cooperation and collaboration still leaves us with the question of what does the dense web of mutual influences between the two countries tell us about antagonism and war? In most cases, sadly little. Indeed, one comes away from many of these transnational studies of the Anglo-German relationship wondering why the two nations should ever have gone to war with one another at all. And this can be thought about more widely in that in some of these drives to move away from the Anglo-German antagonism model, we do sometimes often occlude the conflict and tension between the two countries, which very much exists. And you can think about things like the tensions between the two countries around the war in South Africa in 1899-1902, the fear about German goods flooding into Britain in the 1890s, and so on. So these things definitely exist. This is something that on the one hand we can potentially avoid by paying as much attention to these tensions and blockages as to the sort of nicer flows of cooperative exchange that I've just mentioned. But there's also a further potential solution which comes out of this volume in quite a good way, and where I think the history of intellectual and scholarly relations really does stand out. In that one of the most interesting points that I thought seemed to come out in the essays is that this dichotomy between antagonism and collaboration in many respects doesn't really make sense when you look at how the interactions work on the ground, and when you look at more in-depth case studies of particular instances of this collaboration or competition. So, for example, Pascal Schilling's piece again on the Antarctic expeditions. This, on the one hand, showed that while they're very much engaging in a process of national competition, they're still very much based within interlocking networks and getting ideas off each other. And so, again, there's this key idea that entanglement and antagonism were opposite sides of the same coin, so they're really drawing off the same thing, and that interaction very often has this sort of flip side of, on the one hand, being collaborative, on the other hand, still being competitive. And this is something which I've noticed quite strongly in my own work, and also in the work of another academic, Astrid Svensson, who recently did a very good book on monument preservation in 19th century Britain, France, and Germany. In that, very often when you look at calls from particular national communities to emulate foreign countries and to emulate what's going on, very often scholars draw attention to advances in foreign countries as an idea that they're falling behind their potential rivals. So, for example, in the monument preservation instance, British heritage protection people will look to Germany, look to the legislation which is being put forward to protect old historic castles, and say the Germans are protecting their heritage, we have to do the same, otherwise they will have all these nice monuments and we will have nothing. So very often you have this sort of dynamic which is going on here. Another important point, I thought, was how very often these processes of transnational and international exchange and cooperation, as well as feeding into wider internationalist projects and internationalist collaboration, quite often also feed into the bolstering of senses of national identity or ideas of the distinctiveness of particular nations within the international community of scholars. And this, I think, was a very important trend which was drawn out in Heather's second piece in the volume, which she's got two, which was looking at the British Association and how it was incorporating particularly German scholars into its foreign section. And on the one hand, this was building into a strong internationalist project, but there was still a very definite idea that these scholars were foreign, and it was as much building up a sense of national distinctiveness as it was an exercise in what Heather defines as naive cosmopolitanism. And this is something that we can kind of notice further if we carry the narrative onwards across our very sort of long 19th century into the First World War and the years immediately after. And I think this is a very important kind of development to continue when you're looking at this period, where Anglo-German relations really, to a degree, really sort of collapse as the older collaborative networks break down as the two countries go to war, and then take a very long time to sort of to be reforged. And Tara Windsor's chapter in the volume is really good at looking at how this is a very sort of fitful process. It only really starts getting off the ground in the latter half of the 1920s, and you have this prolonged period of antagonism and kind of exclusion of the German community from these internationalist networks, which is quite often expressed as the Germans being bad internationalists, of having misused science and intellectual activity for particulars, for nationalists, and for kind of exclusivist gains. So very often this idea of internationalism can serve as a sort of stick to beat your opponents on. And this potentially lets us look with new sort of perspectives on other areas in which international scholarly relationships particularly break down. So if we say look at the conflicts around the Napoleonic Wars, around the Franco-Prussian War, and also the onset of the Cold War, we can potentially see the similar things going on in a much broader context. So if we look at the Anglo-German relationship on these terms, then we can actually sort of start looking at more general trends trends on international scholarly relations, how they fit together, and how they break down, and how they interact with processes of competition and antagonism. Okay, now the second big narrative, this rise of the research university as a core zone of knowledge production, is possibly a bit more tricky than the rise of Anglo-German antagonism, which is a fairly sort of straightforward teleology, which is easy to pick apart. Now, the core narrative here is that the universities in the German states developed in the later part of the 18th century and early 19th century a very distinctive sort of institutional identity based on the kind of cultivation of humanistic education, on freedom of research and teaching, of offering professional positions for educated scholars, and patronage for emerging disciplines. And these develop as very highly effective institutions, and are also very effective as models for foreign scholars who want to build up their professional status and entrench new disciplines which they're interested in building. So again, it's part of this process, potentially, of competitive emulation, which is going on between different national communities. And then in the latter part of the 19th century, when we see the rise of laboratory science and the industrial and economic implications of scientific research in the course of the Second Industrial Revolution and the processes going around that, this also begins to attract a lot more research from states and from governments who see the building up of a large university sector and a large network of research laboratories as really important for their national prestige and for their national power and for national security. So we have these distinct focuses which are driving science and scholarship into a particular set of institutions, developing initially in the German context, but then being adopted more widely elsewhere. Now this in itself is an interesting model, which again is interesting to pair up with the sort of Anglo-German antagonism angle, as this process of adoption sees kind of important differences in national adaptation. So in the British context, this is very often presented as displacing the older traditions of gentlemanly amateur scholarship, which are seen as being so important for the early and mid-19th century world. And here a bit of sort of triangulation and diversification of focus is also quite interesting, as one of the biggest reflections on the rise of German science actually occurs in France after French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. And this again is drawing off fears that France has been defeated by German science and needs to adopt many of the German methods in order to remain a great national power. Or if we look to the United States, then again we see the emulation of German models, the importing of German scholars in quite large numbers, and massive funding for higher education. So as we move into the 1890s, 1900s, American institutions have actually begun to outstrip on a very kind of sizable level their German counterparts in resources, in personnel, and capacity. Now, generally, this is quite an appealing model, which has quite a clear, quite a logical narrative. And it's also one which often kind of makes sense to modern academics, as obviously we're almost the inheritors of this process, and we still live and we still work and we still research in these university settings. But there are still a number of ways in which this book, again, attempts to decenter this idea, or at least show it's a bit tricky, one of which is dealing with the transfer process of German science itself, and the other with a kind of broader set of implications, I think. One of the most interesting things that I found in this book, and many of the chapters, is the way in which this importation or reflection on German models in Britain often seems to have reflected as much internal and generational struggles within Britain itself as it did the national community suddenly converting to interest in sort of German science. And in this seems to move across the period. So in the chapters by John Davis, in his discussion of early 19th century humanities reform in British universities, and Rob Bodis in his chapter on animal physiology in the later 19th century, we see how German models are actually being highlighted by a new generation of scholars. So these sort of people who want to build new professional positions, who want to really sort of take over their disciplines, and in many respects are being resisted by an older generation of more entrenched and more kind of and more secure academics who are already in the orthodoxy. So in this, we're very often seeing the way in which these transnational alliances are very often between people in emerging new disciplines who are feeling marginalized or are feeling not in the position they want to be in their own national community, and are seeking out allies abroad, seeking out more prestigious foreign models as a way of building up their own efficiency and their own sort of power and their own influence. Now, on this issue of international exchange, there did seem to be a bit less going the other way, and a bit less reflection on how German scholars reflected on British developments. But the ones which did feature raised some very, very interesting points. There was Angela Schwarz's chapter on popular science publishing. There was Gregory Pelger's chapter on German Jewish scholars who needed to come to Britain to study Jewish manuscripts being held in large English collections. And Rob Bodis's chapter, where he discusses how German anti-vivisection societies often drew inspiration from British techniques and examples in their campaigning. But what these do have is an important commonality in that they're all showing areas of scholarly and intellectual activity which occur outside of the university system and in a much wider set of institutions. So in things like popular publishing and popular education, in museum collections and things like this. And in these kind of areas, in this sort of extra-university intellectual institutions, here British institutions seem to be on much more equal terms with their German counterparts. And this potentially leads to a much more productive course we can take in recognizing that in the 19th century, research universities, while they're definitely growing in prestige, funding, and importance over the 19th century, are still far from the only sites of knowledge generation in this period. And if we adopt a longer time frame, we can see that things like learned associations, like museums and publishing houses, are all important areas where scholars are gaining authority, are conducting scientific work, and disseminating their research and getting employment. And we shouldn't forget that this period of the rise of the research university also sees the rise of the museum reform movement. It also sees the rise of the largest membership in scholarly societies. It also sees an upsurge in scientific expeditions, which is all occurring as part of a much wider set of processes. And many disciplines, particularly in newer kind of sociological fields, very often draw from this extra university context as much from the university ones. And if we look at this sort of wider kind of context of intellectual institutions, then the issue of German superiority against British backwardness becomes a lot less convincing, and we see, I think, a much more balanced distribution of authority between the two countries. And we can potentially push this a bit further, and if we look earlier in the period, into the sort of early 19th century period, we can also even potentially see that the fragmented and the diverse intellectual institutions within the German states can often be presented as much as an area of intellectual weakness as a sign of strength. And we see quite often in this book, among British scholars, the caricature of the German scientist and the German scholar who is presented as being kind of overly pedantic, overly meticulous, overly philosophical, lacking in humanity. And this is quite often contrasted to the kind of well-rounded, leisured natural philosopher in Britain who's firmly in place within his society and dedicated to promoting useful knowledge within society. And also, if we look at a great deal of intellectual activity, particularly in things like the natural sciences, in sort of biology, in natural history, in geology and so forth, quite often in the 19th century this is based around a sense that authority doesn't come from distribution of research, but from collecting a huge amount of specimens in a single central place. And here, big centralized intellectual institutions, so things like Kew in Britain, or the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, or the British Museum in London, can really serve as global centers for these disciplines. And there's much smaller collections in the German lands often see themselves as being quite isolated, quite marginalized, and they have to very often travel to Britain or less frequently to France in order to get authority within these disciplines. So again, rather than just falling into these dichotomies, this does raise definitely the issue that we have to look at these much broader areas of intellectual activity, which this British Anglo-German contrast really does draw out. Now for the final section, I'm going to move on to the way that this book builds into potential new research agendas, as well as some of the issues that we sort of need to look out for when we adopt these new approaches. And I think that the most productive sort of organising principle in the book, which works on both a kind of methodological level and on the level of creating an interesting argument and an interesting level of coherence, is the way in which it focuses not on Anglo-German scholars as blocks defined by their national boundaries, but instead focuses on networks, and either networks of scholars who claim to represent the German national community or the British national community, or particular scientific sets of relationships which cut across the national boundaries. Now this, I think, is a very sort of highly methodologically useful track to take. Because through focusing on groups which either claim to represent the national community or self-consciously go out to expand beyond it, we don't need to take up anachronistic definitions of what particular national communities or nations actually are, and really do kind of place ourselves right in the centre of contemporary debates and contemporary conceptions. And this is particularly important if we look at these two countries in the 19th century. For Germany, who we include as a German is very, very difficult, because obviously the borders changed tremendously. You have German speakers living not just in what's now Germany and Austria, but also in eastern France and large parts of the Russian Empire. You then have the issue that when the German Reich is established in 1871, this quite often seems to be a diminishment in what is considered to be Germany, as the old Austrian Habsburg territories are kind of shunted out. So if historians are studying this period, we either have to adopt this quite confused area where we follow the territorial boundaries and who's living within them, or we can actually attempt to look more at networks, look more at self-definition, and attempt to look at things that way. Looking at Britain is also equally tricky. In this period, not only do we have to deal with the four nations of the British Isles, and always the very, very complicated issue of whether we include Ireland within our concept of Britain in this period. But also, as we're moving into the colonial era, what do we do with the British Empire, British scholars working there, and the colonies of settlement in particular? Like, do Anglophone scholars in South Africa, in Australia, and in Canada count as being British, or are they sort of proto-national? So here, the examination of groups which are claiming to represent and speak for the scholarly nation allows us to not only avoid these problems, but also to work out how either the colonies of settlement or how the wider German-speaking Europe interacts with what you could potentially term the core. And so things like the British Association holding congresses in Toronto in Australia, in this case that becomes very, very interesting in the context of these national definitions, or that the German Society for Anthropology, that in 1871 it doesn't invite its Vienna section to join the wider federal body. This again shows us how scholarly communities are interacting with these wider nation-building projects. The other area where this focus on networks has big advantages is building into what I think is fast becoming this new sort of master narrative of 19th century history, and also spreading very strongly into the history of science, intellectual history. This is really, with the modern period, being seen as a period of increased global connection, of circulation and network building, which is very often occurring in tandem with the traditional forces of nation and empire building, which have previously tended to attract attention. And this is something which is very, very strongly appearing in both the British and both the Anglophone and the German literature, with both the sort of rise of various forms of transnational history across, really across the historical discipline, with the idea of knowledge in transit, which is increasingly becoming the way in which history of science is written, and even with things like Christopher Bailey's Birth of the Modern World, or Jürgen Osterhammer's Die Verwandlung der Welt. These are fast becoming, set texts in 19th century history in university syllabuses. So this is really kind of a sort of major trend which is going on. And this is also something that we very, very strongly see in this volume, with these entanglements, exchanges, and mutual perceptions being seen to be key to the scholarly development in both countries, with this process of interaction being key to forming disciplines, forming institutions, and forming senses of scholarly and intellectual identity. One issue that I saw about the book, and definitely noticed, is that in terms of the entanglements that were being drawn out, there did seem to be a very sort of definite focus between institutions within the southeast of England and sort of Protestant maritime northern Germany, and so especially between, say, southwestern England, London, some Scotland, but then especially how it interacted with Prussia, Hanover, where there's a very obvious, very important dynastic connection, and the Hanseatic cities. Now, on the one hand, this potentially leads us to think that this is a set of potentially sort of maritime links around the North Sea, around the Baltic, and around the quite established commercial networks which are existing there. But it could also potentially affect draw off the issue that even nowadays, even with a kind of increased awareness of regional diversity in both countries, an awful lot of British history is still quite southeast England centred, and an awful lot of German history is still Prussia centred, despite many, many calls to decenter Prussia. So, so this is a sort of a potential gap, and I think one area where we can potentially see where we can potentially follow this up is to see whether this idea of a maritime Baltic North Sea area actually makes sense, or whether there are sort of different dynamics or similar processes operating in Catholic southern Germany and the Habsburg lands, where many of which are very, very intellectually dynamic and have a lot of their very own distinctive intellectual culture. The wider issue, though, is the global and the imperial dimension, which is something that Heather just mentioned, something which I think is a very important kind of one to take too. And this is where the Anglo-German relationship becomes incredibly interesting and has a lot of wider things to say about global history and how we conceptualize the place of not only Britain and Germany in the world, but also wider formation of global networks and global exchanges in this period. One of the most productive developments, I think, in modern British history over the past couple of decades is the recognition put forward by Catherine Hall and others that you can't understand metropolitan Britain without understanding its interaction with colonial territories, and that these two areas very much define one another in an almost sort of equitable sort of way, and really bringing the colonial dimension really back into the centre of metropolitan life and metropolitan developments. And conversely, one of the most important developments, I think, in the recent literature of 19th century Germany has been the adoption of this kind of global colonial approach, very often taking inspiration from these British researchers. And in looking at how Germans conceptualize their place in the world, even before the period in which Germany develops its own not particularly impressive colonial empire, but still the Germans still very much reflect on European expansion into the Americas, into Asia, into Africa, and very much conceptualize themselves as part of the wider European project. But again, I think it's possible to kind of push this further, and one of the big gaps, I think, that you very often see in this recent British world literature is that it has been incredibly Anglophone-centric. And and very often, this is something that's been widely noted by a number of people, and really neglects the very, very important relationships that British institutions not only maintain with the European continent, but also how European scholars very often use the British Empire and the international networks which are developing around it, really as their own zone of operation and their own area of research. So you have, for example, German, Swedish, Italian and Spanish scientists all working within places like Canada, working in South Africa, working in Australasia, and really forming a very, very important part of the scientific and scholarly personnel there. And here again, I think Pascal Schilling's chapter on the Antarctic expeditions and Hilary Howe's chapter on the anthropological researches in New Guinea were really good indicators of how this continues into the colonial period. And so this is really sort of leading us to kind of draw these two historiographies together of the German and wider European conceptions of their own global position with this new British historiography. This, however, as my kind of final point, is leading us to one of the questions which I thought was sort of hanging over the book and which did appear in many, many sections as a brief mentioning, and also in studies of Anglo-German relations more generally, which is really how important is the Anglo-German relationship in relation to connections with that of other powers. There's a discussion in the introduction which attempts to make the case that Anglo-German entanglements are comparatively, potentially more dense than say British comparisons with British entanglements with, say, France, with Russia, or the United States. Now, as someone who works on France as much as I do on Britain and Germany, and increasingly also the United States, I'm less convinced that Anglo-German relations are more dense than, say, Franco-German relations or Anglo-French dimensions. For French and German scholars in particular, the kind of enemy role between the two countries is really important. And the relations between Germany and the United States are very, very close and very, very significant, with huge migration going back and forth across the Atlantic. Likewise, I don't work on the Russian Empire, but from what I know, and from what I know specialist studies of science and scholarship in Russia, quite often German scientists and German scholars are also using the Russian Empire as a kind of substitute empire to conduct their own scientific researches and ways of looking at things. There's quite often this issue that these multilateral connections and these multinational networks potentially become more significant for future research than these bilateral ones. But I'm also by way of my conclusion, I'm less convinced that we really need to prove this issue of density to really drive home the importance of the Anglo-German relationship. Because we do have these big narratives which do put the Anglo-German relationship as central to a whole load of areas in modern history, and the ways in which scholarly relations between the two countries operate do show us a lot more widely applicable things about intellectual exchange, intellectual emulation across the modern period more generally. So we, for example, see how our broad stereotypes of an amateur, gentlemanly, popular and commercial kind of science in Britain, and this more professionalizing, university-based, experimental and state-orientated kind of science in Germany. On the one hand, this potentially holds up, but if we examine the entanglements between the two countries, we can also see how quite a lot of German science was also sort of amateur and voluntarist. A lot of British science was professionalizing, and also that the kind of amateur voluntarist science wasn't a sort of intellectually antiquated or dead zone. It was very often highly kind of active and highly productive. And finally, I think the sort of often fractious and often collaborative relationship between Britain, the German states, and wider European and global contexts does put us in a very good position to look more widely at these wider networks, circulations, and exchanges in the modern world, and the kind of processes which are driving them together and destabilizing them. Okay, thank you.
I'm only going to be brief, which will be reassuring to everyone who's heard this accent before. But firstly, before I do anything else, I just want to say, as somebody who wasn't involved in this project at all, thank you to Chris for what I think, having read the book, was a really judicious, thorough assessment and appreciation of what the book represents. So thank you very much for that, Chris. And I think actually really elucidated some of the really profound questions and issues that Heather's and her collaborators' work raises. And speaking as an historian of education, for those who don't know what I do, I work primarily on the political economy of higher education in the UK after 1945. There's so much that Chris spoke about that resonates very strongly with me as an historian of education, and also as an historian more broadly. And I thought the way, Chris, that you broke it down into those two narratives that he wants to problematise and he wants to talk about was really, really useful. And I thought also pointed up one of the real strengths of what Heather does and what our team did as historians of education, which is relate the subfield to the field. In other words, make history of education relevant to bigger debates within the context of modern British history, modern German history, and in fact European history in general, which I think is absolutely vital, particularly the bigger your canvas gets. I think you know, the questions that you raised, Chris, about the Anglo-German antagonism, the questions that are implicit and explicit in the book, you know, really point up this issue about the bigger a historian gets in terms of their subject matter, the more dangerous the issue of generalisation. And these sorts of studies where we look at something in terms of a network or in terms of a migration or in terms of an interrelationship at a more micro level than that macro level, problematise those narratives and also give us a greater richness and a greater appreciation of what, if any, validity the grand narrative still has. So before I move off that, one of the questions I want to flag up, which Chris can respond to in a moment, is just this issue of having problematized this idea of the Anglo-German antagonism, does it still have any validity? Is there really mileage in it at all in the conventional sense? Because while you were speaking, Chris, one thing that occurred to me, and has occurred to me many times when thinking about Paul Kennedy's work and the work of many others right in the 60s and 70s about this period, A.J.P. Taylor even, of course, of German history, First World War, is how much is Paul Kennedy, how much is A.J.P. Taylor really writing about the Cold War, as opposed to actually writing about the period that he's supposed to be writing about. And to build upon that, how much have the authors such as Kennedy, and then us as historians of education working on micro studies, like, for example, in my case, many years ago, I worked on the foundation of Queen Mary College, University of London. How much have we been influenced by those narratives, but also how much were they influenced in their own time by disciplines such as economics and international relations and their assumptions that then funneled this narrative? Just to explain to the interdisciplinary audience, what I mean to say is, Chris was outlining a great book, The Rise of the Anglo-German Antagonism by Paul Kennedy. He was talking about how this teleologically posited this inexorable rise in antagonism between the two powers that ultimately resulted in two world wars. And one of the arguments that I'm really putting to Chris here is how much was that argument influenced both by the situation which Kennedy himself was writing, which is a classic historical landmine to step on, but also to what extent were the other disciplines that were in vogue in the time Kennedy was writing IR and economics responsible for the way in which he saw things as inevitably competitive. So that's my first question. How much does the Anglo-German antagonism still hold weight the more studies like this are done? And my second question, which obviously relates to the first because you relate to the narratives brilliantly, is this issue about the research university. And speaking, unfortunately, from an Anglophone perspective, because believe it or not, I am English. Americans never believe that. But speaking from an Anglophone perspective, to what extent does that narrative still hold water in terms of the export? I mean, you've problematised it very ably, I know Heather has too, in terms of the German research university was basically exported to Britain and then adapted for local conditions. But one point I just want to raise about that in terms of being able to bring anything to the discussion on my own part is simply this idea that I know across the period, I know that you do too, in many ways the German university was the ideal type reference in many scholarly debates in Britain from the period, at least from the 1870s onwards, if not much earlier, frankly, with biblical scholarship and so on and so forth, right through to the Second World War. Now, one of the little golden nuggets I once found in an archive was a British intelligence report from 1942, which condemned the German universities in very stark terms as authoritarian, anti-Semitic, nasty entities that should be repudiated at all costs. And the British intelligence report said fundamentally that they played a pivotal role in the rise of National Socialism. Now, I don't think that report, for what it's worth, stands water as a report. I think what's interesting about it is what it tells us about British attitudes and how they had changed, particularly within the Mandarinates, within the British High Command, if you like, of the political structure. And taking it back to the Anglo-German Scholarly Network, what I wonder, coming out of that, is how much of the fall of the German university in terms of the mindset and its replacement basically by the American universities, the ideal type, how much did that have to do actually with the resilience of these networks? How much did that have to do with the emigre German scholars that arrived in Britain in the 1930s, fleeing National Socialism, who actually, very much influenced the decline of the German university in the British mindset, which in many ways proves the point. It proves the point of the long 19th century. It actually means that the Anglo-German scholarly networks may have brought the ideal type of the German universities were closed in British discourse. So, it's not, those things aren't in contrast with each other, they actually facilitate each other. So they're the 2 points that I really have for you, Chris, before we throw it open to the floor. Once again, I just want to say thank you. I thought that was a really impressive elucidation of the core ideas of Harvard. And I thought it really exposed what historians of education at their best, like Heather, try to do, which is explore a range of much broader issues through the lens of education. So thanks again, Chris.